30 seconds earlier, I sat at my father-in-law's dinner table and listened to my wife tell everyone she loved that I was a nobody. She said it in front of her father, in front of her sister, in front of every person in that room who mattered to her. And she had no idea, not for 1 second, that the man she was humiliating already owned the roof over her family's heads. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I glanced at my watch instead, because I knew something none of them did. I knew that in a matter of minutes, a woman named Diane Marsh was going to walk through that front door carrying a single folder, and by the end of that dinner, one marriage would be over, and one family empire would belong to a man they had never once bothered to ask about. I want you to picture that room exactly as it was, because I've replayed it more times than I can count since. A wedding photo of Claire and me still sitting on the mantel behind her father's chair, taken back when none of this seemed possible. A manila folder marked confidential, sitting in Diane's bag in a car parked just down the street, waiting for 8 o'clock. And somewhere in the back of my mind, an image I couldn't shake of the Ashworth furniture sign outside her father's factory, a sign that had stayed lit for 40 years because of money that had never once carried my name attached to it. Everything that was about to happen in that dining room had already been decided. Claire just didn't know it yet. Before I take you through exactly how we got to that table, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I grew up in a small rented house outside Dayton, Ohio, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a diner and never once complained about it in front of me. Our house didn't have much, but it had routine, and routine was its own kind of comfort. My mother woke up before sunrise, came home smelling like coffee and fryer oil, and still found the energy to check my homework at the kitchen table every single night. She used to tell me that the people who talk the most about what they have are usually the ones who worry the most about losing it, and that lesson stuck with me longer than almost anything else she ever said. I didn't understand it fully until I was much older, sitting in rooms with people who had far more money than my mother ever touched in her life, and far less peace to show for it. By 19, I was working construction, pouring concrete in the summer heat, coming home each night with my hands raw and my back aching in a way that made sleep come easy. At night, instead of going out with the other guys on the crew, I sat at a second-hand desk in my room reading everything I could find about real estate, lending, and small business finance, teaching myself in library corners what other men my age were paying tuition to learn in classrooms. I made mistakes early, small ones, a bad loan here, an overestimated property there, but I treated every mistake like tuition I couldn't afford to waste twice. Nobody handed me anything, and honestly, I never wanted anyone to. I built a small lending and investment firm from almost nothing, one careful deal at a time, brick by brick, the same way the men on my old construction crew used to build a foundation, slow and unglamorous, and built to last. By the time I met Claire, that firm was quietly worth more than anyone in her family would have believed if you had told them outright, and I liked it that way. I never saw the point in announcing what I had built. I'd watched enough men flash money around only to lose it within a few years, and I decided early that I would rather be underestimated by strangers than overexposed to people who only respected numbers. Claire and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party, the kind of event where everyone is a little overdressed and a little too eager to make conversation. She was standing near the drink table, laughing at something, and when our eyes met, she didn't look away first. That alone told me something about her I liked immediately. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, and not once did she ask me what I did for a living, which felt like a small miracle at the time. She talked about growing up in a house where appearances mattered more than she wished they did, about wanting a life that felt steady rather than impressive. I told her about my mother, about the diner, about pouring concrete in July heat, and she listened the way people listen when they actually want to understand you, not just wait for their turn to speak. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony her mother considered modest by Ashworth family standards, and for a long time after that, our life together felt exactly like what both of us had been quietly hoping for. I remember thinking, more than once in those early years, that I had finally built something no spreadsheet could measure. Claire came from a very different world than mine, and it showed in small ways long before it ever became a problem. Her father, Robert Ashworth, had spent 4 decades building a furniture manufacturing company that once carried real weight in their small Pennsylvania town, the kind of business that got its name printed on the sides of trucks and mentioned at Chamber of Commerce dinners. Robert had built that company back when American furniture manufacturing still meant something on a national scale, back before overseas production undercut nearly every mid-sized manufacturer in that industry. By the time Claire was in her 20s, the company her father was so proud of was already struggling in ways the family didn't discuss openly at dinner, competing against factories overseas that could produce the same pieces for a fraction of the labor cost. Claire grew up believing the Ashworth name still meant something, because to her, growing up inside that house, it always had. What Claire never knew, what I had never told her, was that 2 years before we ever met, my firm had quietly extended a line of credit to a struggling Pennsylvania furniture company through a holding entity that didn't carry my name anywhere on the paperwork. It wasn't a decision I made with any particular family in mind. It was simply a deal that made sense on paper, a manufacturer with real assets and a real customer base that needed a bridge to modernize its production line. I hadn't done it to get close to her family, and I hadn't even connected the dots myself until months into dating her, when a casual comment from her father about his company's lending arrangement made something click into place that I couldn't unclick. I sat with that realization for weeks before I ever said a word to anyone about it, turning it over in my mind, trying to decide whether it changed anything about how I felt for her. It didn't. I chose to say nothing, then and for years afterward. I told myself it was a coincidence I didn't need to complicate, that revealing it would only make things strange between Claire and me, or worse, make her family treat our marriage like a business transaction instead of what it actually was. So I kept that knowledge to myself, watching quietly as my own company continued, year after year, to be the reason the Ashworth name still had a factory running and a business attached to it at all. There were nights early in our marriage when I almost told her, sitting across from her at dinner, watching her talk proudly about her father's company, feeling the words rise up in my throat before I swallowed them back down. I told myself I was protecting her. Looking back, I think I was also protecting the version of our marriage where I got to be loved for exactly who I was, without a dollar figure attached to it. Marriage changed the way Claire's family looked at me, slowly at first, then unmistakably. In the beginning, the questions felt harmless, almost curious. Robert would ask, at nearly every gathering, some version of the same question, wondering aloud what exactly I did for work that never seemed to require a suit or a business card. I would give him a short, honest answer, something about investments and lending, and he would nod the way people nod when they've already decided your answer isn't worth following up on. Claire's sister, Megan, married to a man who ran his own accounting practice, made small comments about my truck, my boots, the way I never seemed to dress for the rooms I was standing in. At first, these comments felt like teasing. Over the years, they hardened into something closer to a verdict the family had quietly reached about me and simply never bothered to revisit. I remember one particular Christmas, maybe 6 years into our marriage, when Megan's husband gave a long toast about ambition and building a legacy, looking straight at Robert the entire time, and afterward Claire's mother turned to me and asked, half joking, whether I ever planned on doing something with my life beyond driving that old truck around town. Claire laughed along with the room that night, and I remember the specific feeling of sitting there, glass in hand, saying nothing, while the woman I loved let a room full of people laugh at an entire life I had built without her family's help or approval. Claire, caught between the family she had grown up trying to please and the husband she had chosen, began to go quiet in those moments instead of defending me, and I noticed every single time she did. I never brought it up afterward. I simply filed it away, the same careful way I filed away every number in every deal I had ever made. By the 10th year of our marriage, I had stopped expecting Claire to defend me in front of her family, and I told myself that was fine, that I didn't need her approval or theirs to know what I had built. But something had shifted between us long before that dinner, something I couldn't name at the time. Claire had grown distant in small ways, working later, taking calls in other rooms, spending more weekends at her father's company helping with what she called restructuring work. I noticed, the way I noticed everything, but I told myself it was stress, or her father's declining business, or simply the natural wear that 11 years puts on any marriage. I wanted to believe the easiest explanation, because the alternative wasn't something I was ready to sit with yet. 3 weeks before that dinner, I found something on Claire's phone that I was never supposed to see. A string of messages between my wife and Craig Dalton, the man who had spent the last several years working as Robert's business partner and closest advisor inside the company. I hadn't gone looking for anything. Her phone had simply been left on the kitchen counter, screen lit up with a message that made me pick it up without thinking twice. The messages went back further than I wanted to believe, months at least, filled with a familiarity that left very little room for another explanation. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a very long time, reading words meant for someone else, feeling something in my chest go completely still, the way a room goes still right before a storm actually arrives. I didn't confront her that night. I remember setting the phone back down exactly where I found it, walking outside, and sitting in my truck in the driveway for almost an hour without turning the engine on. I didn't confront her the next morning either, or the morning after that. For nearly a week, I went through the motions of a normal life, making coffee, going to meetings, sitting across from Claire at dinner while she talked about her day, all while carrying a piece of knowledge that had completely rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. People who haven't lived through something like that assume the natural response is anger, immediate and loud. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity, a strange, quiet focus that told me if I reacted emotionally in that moment, I would lose the one advantage I actually had, which was knowing something Claire didn't yet know I knew. Instead, I did what I had always done when something mattered enough to get right. I gathered every piece of proof quietly, methodically, without a single outburst, screenshotting messages, noting dates, cross-referencing them against Claire's calendar and the trips she claimed were for her father's business. Then I called the one person I trusted completely with all of it, my attorney, Diane Marsh, a woman I had worked with for nearly a decade on deals far less personal than this one. Diane had built her career on being exact, unemotional, and impossible to catch off guard, which was exactly why I trusted her with something this fragile. When I sat across from her and laid out what I had found, she didn't offer sympathy first. She asked questions, precise ones, the kind that told me she was already 3 steps ahead, already building a case in her mind before I had finished explaining the problem. What Diane found when she started pulling records did more than confirm the affair. She requested financial statements from Ashworth Furniture as part of due diligence tied to my firm's existing credit line, a routine request Robert's accounting team had no reason to question. Buried inside those records, Diane found a pattern of transfers Craig had authorized over nearly 3 years, moving money into accounts that had no clear business purpose, always in amounts small enough to avoid drawing immediate attention, always timed around quarters when Robert was too consumed with production numbers to look closely. It confirmed something I had suspected but never fully investigated, that Craig had been steering money out of the Ashworth Company in ways Robert himself didn't fully understand, using his position and his closeness to the family to move funds that should never have moved in the first place. I now held 3 separate truths that nobody else in that family had any idea existed, and each one on its own would have been enough to end something. I held proof of my wife's affair, message by message, date by date. I held proof of exactly how deep my own company's money ran through her father's business, proof that had been sitting quietly in filing cabinets for years. And I held proof that the man my wife had chosen to betray me with had also been quietly betraying her father for years, siphoning money out of a company that was already fighting to survive. I sat with all 3 truths for several days before I ever mentioned a plan to Diane, turning them over individually, then together, trying to understand what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of using them. I called an old friend from my construction days, a man named Walter who had known me since before I owned anything worth mentioning, and I asked him, without giving away the details, what he would do if he were standing where I was standing. He told me something I've thought about often since. He said that men who get hurt quietly tend to explode loudly, and men who get hurt loudly tend to fix things quietly, and that the version of me he'd always known was the second kind. That conversation helped me decide something important. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone out of anger. I was interested in making sure the truth landed exactly once, clearly, in front of the people who needed to hear it, so that no one could later rewrite what actually happened. I decided, calmly, that all three truths deserved to be spoken in the same room, at the same time, in front of the people who needed to hear them most. I didn't choose that particular dinner by accident. Robert had been planning it for months as a celebration of 40 years in business, a room full of family and longtime associates gathered to toast a legacy everyone assumed was still standing on solid ground. I understood that if I was ever going to say what needed to be said, it would need to happen exactly there, in front of exactly those people, so that no one in that family could later pretend they hadn't heard it clearly or soften it into something more comfortable to remember. In the weeks leading up to that dinner, I lived two separate lives inside the same house. In one, I was a husband going through the ordinary motions of marriage, asking Claire about her day, sitting beside her at church on Sunday, sleeping in the same bed. In the other, I was meeting Diane after work in her office with the blinds drawn, going over documents line by line, deciding exactly what would be said and in what order. There was one evening, about 10 days before the dinner, when Claire asked me, almost offhandedly, if something was bothering me, because I'd been quieter than usual. I told her I was just tired from work, and she accepted that answer easily, which told me something about how little she was looking for the truth in that moment. I asked Diane to arrive at 8 o'clock sharp on the night of the dinner, and I told her exactly what to bring. Then, on the night itself, I put on one of my 3 flannel shirts, drove my old truck to my father-in-law's house, and sat down at a table where, within the hour, my wife would stand up and call me nobody in front of everyone she loved. The dinner started the way most Ashworth family dinners started, with Robert holding court at the head of the table, retelling the story of how he built his company from a single workshop behind his childhood home, a story I had heard a dozen times before, but that always seemed to grow slightly larger with each telling. Megan's husband nodded along and refilled his own wine glass twice before the appetizers were even cleared. Longtime family friends and a few of Robert's oldest business associates filled the remaining seats, all of them dressed like the occasion demanded it, all of them familiar with the Ashworth name in a way that made the room feel more like a small ceremony than an ordinary dinner. I sat near the middle of the table, quiet as always, watching Claire laugh a little too easily at things that weren't especially funny, the way people do when they're trying hard not to think about something else. Someone, an old family friend I barely recognized, turned to me partway through the meal and asked, in that same familiar tone the family always used, what exactly it was that I did for work these days, the kind of question dressed up as small talk that had really always been something closer to an evaluation. Claire had been drinking steadily since the appetizers, and something about that question, asked in front of people she was desperate to impress on her father's biggest night in years, cracked something loose in her that had clearly been building for a long time. She didn't answer for me kindly. She didn't even hesitate the way people usually do before saying something they'll regret. She said it flatly, dismissively, the words landing across the table like a verdict, that I did nothing worth mentioning, that I was, in her own words, a nobody, and she didn't even know why she'd stayed quiet about it as long as she had. The table went silent in the particular way rooms go silent when everyone realizes something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Megan looked down at her plate, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Robert set down his glass slowly, his expression somewhere between embarrassment and confusion, clearly unsure whether to defend me, agree with his daughter, or simply pretend the moment hadn't happened at all. The family friend who had asked the original question suddenly found something fascinating to look at on the tablecloth. And I, the man who had just been called nobody by his own wife in front of the family he had spent years quietly propping up, didn't raise my voice, didn't defend myself, didn't even look particularly surprised. I simply glanced at my watch, calculated that there were still a few minutes left, and reached for my water glass as though nothing at all had happened. Claire, catching the strange calm on my face, felt the first flicker of something she couldn't quite name yet, a small, cold discomfort that told her, somewhere beneath the wine and the anger, that she may have just made a very serious mistake. She opened her mouth once, as if to soften what she'd said, then closed it again, unsure how to walk back words that had already landed exactly the way they were going to land. Robert cleared his throat and tried to steer the table back toward the toast he'd been planning to give, raising his glass again, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. For about 90 seconds, the dinner tried to resume its normal shape, conversation stumbling back in emotion, silverware clinking again, and I sat through every second of it knowing exactly how much time was left before that fragile normalcy would be gone for good. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Robert, still trying to recover the mood of his anniversary dinner, glanced toward the front hall and told one of the staff to answer it, assuming it was a late guest arriving with an excuse about traffic. Instead, Diane Marsh walked into that dining room carrying the same folder I had pictured sitting in her bag all evening, dressed plainly, carrying herself with the kind of composure that made the entire room instinctively quiet down before she'd said a single word. She asked, politely but firmly, for everyone's attention. I stood, introduced her simply as my attorney, and said there was something the family needed to hear before the night went any further. Claire's face changed instantly, the color draining from it in a way I hadn't seen since the day her mother passed. Whatever composure she had left after her own outburst disappeared the moment she saw that folder, because some instinct in her already understood that whatever was inside, it was not going to be small. Diane didn't raise her voice either, and she didn't need to. She spoke the way people speak when they already know every fact in the room will hold up under scrutiny, calm, unhurried, methodical. She explained, first, that the company which had quietly kept Ashworth Furniture solvent for the past 2 years, the lender that had extended the credit line preventing bankruptcy filings Robert had never disclosed to his own family, was a holding entity belonging to Brooks Capital, the company I owned entirely. She placed the loan documents on the table as she said it, dates and figures printed clearly enough for anyone to read. Robert's face went pale in a way none of his children had ever seen. He reached for the papers with hands that weren't entirely steady, reading them twice as though the numbers might change if he looked hard enough. Megan's hand went to her mouth, and Claire, who had just finished telling an entire room that her husband was nobody, sat frozen as she began to understand that the man she had humiliated was, in fact, the reason her father's company still had a name to celebrate it all. Diane wasn't finished. She placed a second document on the table, a filing for divorce, citing infidelity under the terms of a prenuptial agreement Claire had signed and long since forgotten about, naming Craig Dalton specifically as the other party, along with a small stack of printed messages and dates to support it. The name landed on that table like a physical weight. Claire tried, briefly, to speak, forming the beginning of a denial before the words simply died in her throat, because she could see from the specificity of what Diane was holding that denial would only make things worse. Robert turned toward Craig, who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table all evening, saying almost nothing since the appetizers, and for the first time that night, I watched something other than shock cross my father-in-law's face, something closer to betrayal on an entirely separate front. Diane calmly explained the third piece, that Craig had also been moving money out of the very company he was supposed to be protecting, and produced the transfer records to prove it. In the space of a few short minutes, 3 secrets that had taken years to build collapsed onto that dinner table at once, and nobody in that room was the same person they had been when the meal began. Craig stood up first, mumbling something about needing air, and left through the front door without looking at anyone, and nobody stopped him. Robert asked the remaining guests, gently but firmly, to give the family a moment alone, and the room emptied out in a slow, uncomfortable shuffle of chairs and murmured excuses. Megan stayed seated, staring at the loan documents as though rereading them might make the last 5 minutes make more sense. And Claire sat perfectly still across from me, the folder now closed on the table between us, looking at me not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if she were seeing me clearly for the very first time in 11 years of marriage. Claire didn't cry, at least not right away. She sat very still, staring at the folder, then at me, searching my face for some sign of cruelty she could hold on to, some proof that this was revenge dressed up as justice. She didn't find it. My expression was the same calm, unreadable expression I had worn since the moment she called me nobody, and somehow that calmness frightened her more than anger ever could have. Robert, meanwhile, had gone quiet in a different way, the quiet of a man realizing that the empire he had spent 40 years building had been standing, unknowingly, on the goodwill of a son-in-law he had never once taken seriously enough to ask a real question. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, quietly, he said the only thing he could manage, that he owed me an apology he didn't know how to begin giving. I told him it could wait. That night wasn't about apologies yet. Once the family was alone, the conversation that followed lasted almost 2 hours, long after the food had gone cold and the caterers had quietly let themselves out. Robert asked question after question, wanting to understand exactly how long his company had depended on money he never knew existed, and Diane answered each one patiently, laying out timelines and figures until the full picture was impossible to misunderstand. Megan, to her credit, was the first to turn to me directly and apologize, not just for that night, but for years of comments she said she never fully realized were doing real damage. Claire said very little during those 2 hours. She sat at the far end of the table, arms wrapped around herself, occasionally glancing at the wedding photo still sitting on the mantel behind her father's chair, the same photo I had pictured earlier that evening before any of this had happened. In the weeks that followed, the story that spread through that small Pennsylvania town was not the one Claire's family would have chosen to tell if they'd had any say in it. Word moved quickly about the dinner where Robert Ashworth learned his company's survival belonged to a man he had spent years quietly mocking, and about the affair that ended a decade-long marriage in front of witnesses who would never forget it. Craig Dalton was removed from the company within days, quietly, without a public statement, though everyone in that town seemed to know the real reason within a week regardless. The financial records Diane had uncovered were handed over to Robert directly, not out of vengeance, but because I insisted the man deserved to know the full truth about who had actually been standing beside him for the better part of a decade, guiding decisions that were never entirely in the company's best interest. I didn't use what I knew to destroy the company my own money had been quietly holding together, even though I could have called the loan due immediately and watched the entire business collapse within months. I offered Robert one condition to keep the business running: full transparency going forward, regular reporting on the company's finances that I would personally review, and Craig gone for good with no severance beyond what the law required. Robert accepted without hesitation, and in the months since, he has kept his word completely, sending me quarterly reports himself rather than delegating it to anyone else. That decision surprised almost everyone who assumed a man wronged this deeply would want nothing more than to watch it all fall apart. But destruction was never actually the point for me. The point was making sure the truth finally carried more weight in that family than appearances ever had. The divorce moved quickly once the paperwork was filed, in part because the prenuptial agreement Claire had signed years earlier left very little room for negotiation once infidelity was established and documented. There was one mediation session where Claire tried, briefly, to argue that the terms were unfair, that 11 years of marriage deserved more consideration than a piece of paper signed before either of us fully understood what our lives would become. Her own attorney, gently, told her the same thing Diane had already told me, that the document was airtight, drafted carefully years earlier by people who understood exactly what they were protecting against. Claire moved out of the house 3 weeks after that dinner, taking very little with her, and we have not spoken since the final paperwork was signed months later. Claire was left to face the consequences of a single sentence she could never take back, a prenuptial agreement that protected almost nothing for her once infidelity was on the record, and a family that now saw her differently, not as the daughter who had married beneath her, but as the daughter who had nearly cost them everything by underestimating the one person who had quietly been holding it together the entire time. I heard, through Megan, that Claire eventually moved to another state to start over somewhere nobody knew the story, and I understood that decision completely, even if I never reached out to confirm it myself. Some choices only make sense from a distance, and I decided a long time ago that distance was the kindest thing I could offer both of us at this point. I, for my part, changed almost nothing about how I lived. I kept the same truck, the same modest house, the same 3 flannel shirts, because none of it had ever been about proving anything to anyone, not to Claire, not to her family, not even to myself. I had simply been waiting, patiently, for the moment when the truth would matter more than my silence. And when that moment finally came, I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. A few weeks after everything settled, I drove out to visit my mother, still living in the same small house outside Dayton where I grew up, and I told her the entire story from beginning to end, sitting at her kitchen table the way I used to as a boy. She listened quietly, the way she always had, and when I finished, she simply said that she always knew patience would serve me better than pride, and that my father, had he lived to see it, would have said the exact same thing. There's something worth sitting with in a story like this one, something beyond the shock of a single dinner table collapsing under the weight of secrets 3 different people had been carrying for years. It is easy to mistake quiet for weakness, and easy to assume that the person who says the least in the room has the least to offer it. I spent 11 years letting an entire family believe whatever they wanted to believe about me, not because I lacked the ability to correct them, but because I understood something most people take a lifetime to learn, that real strength rarely needs an audience, and the truth, when it finally does arrive, tends to speak far louder than anyone ever could on its behalf. Money, in the end, was never really the point of that night. The point was that I had spent over a decade being underestimated by people who never once thought to ask a real question, and I had simply decided, at last, to answer it on my own terms. Looking back now, months removed from that dinner, I don't feel triumphant about any of it, and I think that surprises people when I tell them the story in person. I didn't walk away from that table feeling like I had won something. I walked away feeling like I had finally stopped carrying a weight I never should have had to carry alone for 11 years. Robert and I still speak, carefully, respectfully, the way 2 men speak when one of them owes the other more than pride will ever let him say out loud. And he still sends me those quarterly reports without fail, sometimes with a short note attached thanking me for not walking away when I easily could have. Megan calls occasionally now, and our conversations have become warmer than they ever were during my marriage to her sister, which is its own strange kind of resolution. Claire and I have not spoken since the lawyers finished their work, and I don't think we will again, and I've made peace with that in a way I didn't expect to so quickly. If there is one thing I would want you to take from this, it is that you should never assume you know the full weight of a person just because they don't announce it. The quiet ones in the room are not always quiet because they have nothing to say. Sometimes they are quiet because they are still deciding whether you deserve to hear it yet. I decided, that night, that my wife's family deserved the truth all at once, delivered calmly, without a single raised voice, because that is the only kind of justice that actually sticks. Anger fades. Shouting gets forgotten by morning. But a room full of people watching the truth arrive on time, exactly when it was supposed to, is something none of them will ever be able to unremember, and I think, in the end, that matters more than any amount of money ever could. So I want to ask you honestly before you go, have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they had your entire story figured out? And did they ever find out how wrong they were? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. And if a story like mine is one you needed to hear today, don't forget to subscribe, because there are many more stories just like this one still to come.